At 38, Mara Ellison had lost the little store she'd spent 7 years building, owed more money than she could repay, and was trying to convince her 11-year-old daughter that everything was going to be okay, when she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Then, at a forgotten county auction, Mara did something nobody understood. She spent $180, money she could barely afford to lose, on warehouse number 6, a crumbling brick building beside the abandoned Harrow Canal. The roof leaked, the windows were broken, and half the town considered the place worthless. When the auctioneer announced that Mara had actually bought it, someone in the back laughed. Even the contractor who later walked through the building told her she might have paid $180 for a problem that would cost thousands to fix. Mara wondered if they were right. But several days later, while she and her daughter were pulling water-damaged boards from the warehouse's western wall, her daughter suddenly stopped. One section sounded hollow. Behind it, they discovered a narrow, sealed compartment that appeared to have been untouched for decades. Inside sat a wooden crate wrapped in rotting canvas. Mara lifted the lid and found several old merchant journals, their pages filled with names, shipments, debts, and payments dating back generations. At first, they looked like nothing more than forgotten business records until Mara noticed the same initials written beside dozens of mysteriously canceled debts. E.E. Those were the same initials engraved inside the old pocket watch her father had left her before he died. And when Mara finally learned who had written those entries and why, Warehouse 202-6 had been hidden from her family's history, she realized that the $180 building everyone had laughed at was connected to something her family had kept buried for generations. But before we go back to the day Mara lost her store and discover what those journals were really hiding, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're having a peaceful morning, afternoon, or evening, and that something good finds its way to you today. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people, forgotten places, and secrets that can change the meaning of a life, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next one. Now, let's go back to the morning when Mara Ellison stood inside her empty store for the very last time. Mara Ellison turned the key in the front door of Ellison Home and Mercantile for the last time at 9:17 on a gray Monday morning. For 7 years, that small brass key had meant she had somewhere to go. Something she had built herself. Something that belonged to her after her marriage ended. Now the shelves were nearly empty. Cardboard boxes covered the floor, and a pale rectangle on the wall showed where the store sign had hung. Lucy sat on the counter with her backpack beside her, drawing quietly while Mara carried the final box toward the door. "Is that everything, Lucy?" asked Mara. Looked around. 3 unsold lamps, 2 chipped ceramic bowls, a carton of kitchen towels nobody had wanted, even at 70% off. "Pretty much," she forced a smile. "We'll figure out what to do with the rest." Lucy was 11, old enough to understand the word bankrupt, but young enough that Mara desperately wanted it to remain only a word. Outside. Mara unscrewed the wooden Ellison Home and Mercantile sign herself because she could no longer afford to pay anyone for jobs she could do with a borrowed screwdriver. When the final screw came loose, the sign dropped unexpectedly into her hands. For one painful second, she remembered painting those letters at her kitchen table 7 years earlier, while Lucy, then 4, had dipped her fingers into the paint. Mara carried the sign inside without saying anything. Her phone vibrated. The message was from one of her remaining creditors. She had several weeks to settle the outstanding balance before further collection action began. Mara read it twice, locked the screen, and slipped the phone into her pocket. Lucy said, "Are we okay?" Mara answered too quickly, "Of course." After dropping Lucy at school, Mara sat in her car across from the closed store. She gripped the steering wheel and finally allowed herself to admit what she had refused to say in front of her daughter. She had no plan. The remaining inventory had to go somewhere, but storage units around Bellwether cost money every month. Selling everything immediately would bring almost nothing. She needed somewhere cheap, dry, and temporary. That afternoon, a notice on the municipal website led her to a county auction of unwanted properties and structures. Mara went expecting nothing more than perhaps an old garage. Most lots were far beyond her reach. Then the auctioneer reached the final pages. Warehouse number 6, Harrow Canal District. A photograph appeared on the screen. The brick warehouse leaned beside the abandoned canal, its windows dark and several roof sections visibly damaged. The auctioneer listed the warnings almost apologetically. No active electrical service, water intrusion, deteriorated masonry, sale as is. Opening bid, $100. Silence. Mara stared at the photograph. It was ugly, but it was space. 100, she said. Several heads turned. A man near the back chuckled. Someone offered 150. Apparently for amusement more than interest. Mara's stomach tightened. 180. The room went quiet again. $180, the auctioneer repeated. Any advance? None came. The hammer fell. Sold. Mara immediately thought of groceries, gasoline, Lucy's school expenses, every better use for the money she had just spent. Outside the hall, a broad-shouldered man carrying a contractor's folder caught up with her. You bought number 6. Apparently. He smiled, though not unkindly. Daniel Reed. I was looking at another property. He hesitated. Have you actually seen that warehouse? Mara's embarrassment sharpened. I bought it for storage. Then I'd inspect it before you put anything valuable inside. The next evening, Mara drove Lucy to Harrow Canal. Warehouse number 6 looked worse in person. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement, rain stains streaked the brick, and one gutter hung crooked from the roof. Mara stood beside the car, wondering whether the laughter at the auction had been justified. Lucy, however, ran toward the building as though Mara had bought a castle. Mom, it's huge! That isn't necessarily good. Mara unlocked the rusted side gate and approached the heavy door near its upper hinge. Partly hidden beneath peeling paint was a small iron emblem shaped like an ornate capital E. Mara stopped. Something about it bothered her, not fear exactly, but recognition. She could not place. What is it? Lucy asked. Nothing. Mara photographed the emblem, then opened the warehouse. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, Mara sat at their kitchen table, calculating what remained in her bank account. Her eyes drifted to the photograph on her phone. The iron E. She opened the drawer where she kept the few things that had belonged to her father and removed his old pocket watch. It had not worked in years. Mara turned it over, pressed the catch, and opened the back cover. She froze. Engraved into the metal was the same ornate letter she had seen on warehouse number 6, the same unmistakable E. The next afternoon, Mara returned to warehouse number 6 with Lucy and her father's pocket watch tucked into her coat pocket. Daniel Reed was already waiting beside his pickup, a tool bag at his feet. Mara had called the number on the card he had given her after the auction, telling herself she only wanted an inspection, not help. She could not afford. Daniel pushed open the warehouse door and immediately looked upward. First rule, he said, don't trust anything just because it's still standing. Lucy stayed close to Mara as they crossed the dusty floor. In daylight, the building's problems were impossible to ignore. Water had stained the western brick wall nearly black near the floor. Several ceiling beams showed old moisture damage. and a section of warped boards near the rear sagged under its own weight. Daniel crouched and pressed a screwdriver against one plank. "Nobody walks here until I reinforce it." Mara looked at the enormous empty space she had imagined filling with boxes from her store. "How bad?" "Depends what you want from it. Dry storage?" Daniel glanced toward the roof. "Then we stop the water first." Mara waited for a number. When he gave her a rough estimate for materials alone, her stomach tightened. It was several times what she had paid for the building. "I can do some of it myself," she said. "Probably," Daniel stood, "but some of it you shouldn't." Lucy had wandered only a few feet away and was examining a wooden door frame between the main floor and a smaller side room. "Mom!" Look, sketched into the wood were horizontal lines at different heights. Beside them were initials, names, and years written in faded pencil. J. M. 1951, Annie 1953, Thomas 1955. Mara ran her fingers across the marks. "Kids?" Lucy asked. "Looks like it." Daniel frowned. "Strange place to measure children. According to the auction paperwork, Warehouse No. 6 had been a commercial storage building." Mara photographed the markings, then noticed Lucy standing against the frame, measuring herself beside a line from 70 years earlier. "For the first time since the bankruptcy," Mara laughed. The sound surprised her. A vehicle rolled over the cracked pavement outside. A clean, dark sedan stopped near the entrance, and a man in a wool coat stepped out. He introduced himself as Gordon Pike and said he owned several properties near the old Canal herd number 6 finally sold, he said. His eyes moved around the warehouse. "For 180, if the rumor's right." Mara disliked hearing the amount repeated. "That's right. I'll give you 1,000. She thought she had misheard him. Pike explained that the building itself was not much use to him, but consolidating nearby parcels simplified future development. The offer was good through the week. He handed her a card and left without pressure. Mara stared after him. $1,000 would not repair her life, but it would turn a reckless purchase into an $820 profit in less than 2 days. It could pay bills, buy groceries, reduce one small piece of the pressure sitting on her chest every morning. "Are you going to sell it?" Lucy asked. "Maybe." Lucy looked disappointed but said nothing. Daniel returned to examining the western wall. Mara followed him. Trying to think practically. She had bought the warehouse for storage. It could not safely provide that without repairs. Pike was offering an escape. There was no sensible reason to become emotionally attached to a ruined building because of one letter on a door. Yet before leaving, Mara returned to the Iron E and held her father's pocket watch beside it. Daniel noticed, same design. Almost exactly. Family mark. I don't know. Her father had rarely spoken about older generations of the Ellison family. Mara had assumed there was simply nothing interesting to tell. Daniel used a scraper on the door beside the emblem. A brittle strip of paint curled away. Beneath it appeared the edge of an older painted word. Mara helped carefully remove more loose paint. First came an L, then another L. After 20 minutes, enough lettering had emerged across the weathered panel to read what had once been painted there in dark block capitals, Ellison & Co. Mara stepped backward. Lucy looked from the words to her mother. "So this was ours? I don't know," Mara whispered. That evening, Mara called the Bellwether Historical Society. The woman who answered introduced herself as Evelyn Price. A retired librarian who volunteered with the town archives. Mara described the warehouse, the iron emblem, and the faded company name. Evelyn went quiet for a moment before saying that an old merchant company had operated along Harrow Canal, though she would need to check the records before telling Mara more. The following morning, Mara returned to number 6 with Lucy, while Daniel brought temporary materials for the worst roof leak. Mara kept thinking about Pike's $1,000. Every practical instinct told her to take it before the building swallowed money she did not have. Lucy explored the safe section near the western wall, while Mara stacked a few empty boxes. Suddenly, Lucy called. Mara turned. Lucy was tapping one of the old wooden panels with her knuckles. Tap, tap. A dull, solid sound. She moved her hand 2 feet to the left and knocked again. This time, the sound was deeper, hollow. Daniel stopped working. Lucy knocked once more and looked at Mara. "Mom? This part sounds hollow." Daniel crossed the warehouse and tapped the panel beside Lucy's hand. The hollow note came back clearly. He tried the boards above and below it, then crouched to inspect the edges. "These were added later," he said. Mara moved closer. Once Daniel pointed it out, she could see the difference. The surrounding wall was old brick, but a section roughly 6 feet wide had been covered with vertical wooden planks, their dark surfaces warped by age. "A room?" Lucy asked. "Maybe a storage recess," Daniel said. "Let's not imagine treasure yet." Mara almost smiled. "I'd settle for something that pays for the roof." Daniel removed the first board carefully. Dust fell from behind it, making Lucy cough and step back. The second plank cracked near the bottom. Behind the third was darkness, but not the deep darkness of another room. Daniel shone his flashlight through the opening. "It's a cavity, 3 feet deep, maybe 4. They continued until there was enough space to see inside. The hidden area had been built between the original brick wall and the later wooden covering. It contained no doorway, no tunnel, nothing dramatic. Only an old wooden crate, several loose bundles of paper, and decades of dust. Mara felt an unreasonable flicker of disappointment. Then Lucy pointed. "That box was put there on purpose." Daniel reached inside and pulled the crate forward. Its wood was dry despite the dampness elsewhere. A rotting canvas sheet had been wrapped around it and tied with cord that broke when Mara touched it. Inside were folded invoices, shipping manifests, receipts, and 3 thick books bound in dark cloth. Mara lifted the top book. Dust coated her fingers. Faded lettering on its first page read, "Harrow Canal Merchant's Ledger, 1948. The following pages contained columns of dates, names, quantities, and payments. Coal, flour, timber, machine parts, freight charges. Mara turned several pages without understanding why anyone would have hidden ordinary business records behind the wall. "Merchant journals," Daniel said, looking over her shoulder. "Probably accounting books." Lucy picked up a folded manifest. "Are they valuable?" Mara looked around at the leaking warehouse. "I hope so." She meant it more seriously than she wanted Lucy to know. That afternoon, Mara called Evelyn Price again. Evelyn arrived less than an hour later carrying a canvas bag, reading glasses, and the careful excitement of someone accustomed to discovering history in unremarkable boxes. She examined the journals without opening them flat. "Don't force the bindings," she warned Lucy gently. "Old paper remembers every bad decision." Lucy immediately withdrew her hands. Evelyn read several pages and identified company names that had once operated along Harrow Canal. "Some of these families are still in Bellwether," she said. "The Mercers, Donnellys, Hales." Mara's attention shifted to the crate. "Could collectors buy these?" Evelyn looked up. "Possibly. Local commercial records have some value. How much, I couldn't tell you." Mara's disappointment must have shown, because Evelyn added, "Before you sell anything, let me understand what you have." Mara crossed her arms. Understanding it doesn't pay my bills." The words came out sharper than intended. Lucy looked down at the ledger. Mara immediately regretted them. Evelyn did not appear offended. "No, but selling something before knowing what it is can create a different kind of regret." Mara thought of Gordon Pike's offer, $1,000 for the warehouse. Money she could use now, instead of old books that might mean nothing. "One day," she said. "You can look for one day." Evelyn nodded. They carried the journals to a dry table beneath one of the intact roof sections. Daniel returned to reinforcing the unsafe floor, while Lucy helped Evelyn sort loose documents by date. Mara began photographing pages. After nearly an hour, the records remained painfully ordinary. Deliveries, accounts, balances, names. Then Lucy said, "Why are these crossed out?" Evelyn leaned closer. Several entries had been marked through with red ink. Beside each was a short notation. Paid E. They turned another page. The notation appeared again. A grocery account belonging to a family named Mercer. Paid E. 3 pages later, beside freight charges owed by Thomas Hale, paid E. "Who's E? Lucy asked. Mara stopped photographing. She reached instinctively toward her coat pocket, but the pocket watch was at home. She could still picture the ornate E inside its cover. Could be anyone. Mara said. Evelyn was already scanning backward through the ledger. Perhaps. But whoever it was appears often. They counted 11 entries in the first journal alone. Some amounts were small. Others were substantial for the period. Different families, different businesses, the same red ink, the same initials. Mara opened the second journal. Several pages near the back had fused together from moisture. Other sections were stained until the writing became unreadable. She felt a surprising frustration, as if the damaged pages had withheld something personally from her. Can they be saved? Some, Evelyn said, not all. Mara looked toward Lucy. Her daughter was tracing names with one finger without touching the paper. Fascinated. Mara wanted to share that excitement. Instead, she remembered the creditor's message and the boxes still waiting to be stored. She had spent years believing that if she worked hard enough, she could keep uncertainty away from Lucy. Now she was standing inside a broken warehouse studying debts belonging to dead strangers. "Maybe we're making this bigger than it is," she said. Lucy looked up. But Ellison was painted on the door. "That doesn't mean these books are about us." "What if they are?" Mara had no answer. Evelyn closed the journal carefully. "Let me check the Historical Society records tonight. Merchant directories, employment lists, property files. If Ellison and Co. operated here, there should be something." Mara agreed. Though part of her hoped Evelyn would find nothing, nothing would be easier. Nothing could be sold, forgotten, and left behind. The next morning, Mara was sorting inventory from her failed store when her phone rang. Evelyn did not bother with a greeting. "Mara, I found the name." Mara sat down on a cardboard box. "What name?" "The initials. I can't prove every entry yet, but there was an Ellison working at number 6 during the period covered by those journals." Mara tightened her grip on the phone. "Who?" Papers rustled on Evelyn's end. Then she read directly from the record. "Elias Ellison, warehouse clerk, number 6. By noon. Mara was sitting across from Evelyn Price in the Historical Society's cramped records room, surrounded by merchant directories, tax ledgers, and brittle newspapers that smelled faintly of dust and glue. Evelyn had already placed the employment record between them. Elias Ellison, warehouse clerk, number 6. Mara read the line again as if repetition might make it explain itself. "That's it?" she asked. "That's the earliest record I found. Evelyn said there may be more." Lucy sat at the end of the table with a notebook. copying names from photographs Mara had taken of the merchant journals. Daniel had offered to watch the warehouse while they were gone, checking the temporary roof patches before another rain moved in. Mara appreciated the help, though she still felt uneasy every time someone did something for her without handing her a bill. Evelyn opened a directory from 1952. Elias appeared again, this time listed as assistant manager. 4 years later, another record identified him simply as manager, warehouse number 6. So he moved up, Lucy said. Looks that way, Evelyn replied. Mara leaned back. Was he an owner? Evelyn shook her head. Not according to anything I found. That mattered, Mara had imagined, without realizing it, that Elias might have been some forgotten wealthy relative whose company name explained the iron E and the faded Ellison and Company lettering. Instead, the records described an employee, a clerk, later a manager, respectable, perhaps, but hardly the kind of man who could casually pay other people's debts. Evelyn pulled the first photographed journal closer. Let's stop looking at Elias for a moment and look at the names around him. They began building a list. Mercer, Hale, Donnelly, Brennan, Cooper. Some appeared once. Others returned across multiple pages. Several still belonged to families in Bellwether. Evelyn found an address for an elderly man named Arthur Mercer, whose grandmother's name matched one of the entries marked in red. Mara hesitated when Evelyn suggested visiting him. We're going to knock on a stranger's door and ask if his dead grandmother owed money? Not quite like that, Evelyn said. I hope. Arthur Mercer lived in a narrow brick house 3 streets uphill from the old Canal lady. He was 84, thin, sharp-eyed, and suspicious until Evelyn introduced herself. When Mara mentioned warehouse number 6, his expression changed. Number 6? He looked at Mara more closely. You bought that place? A few days ago. Lord help you. Lucy smiled. Mara did not. They sat in a small front room crowded with family photographs. Mara showed Arthur the journal entry for Margaret Mercer. Flour, coal, lamp oil, and 2 unpaid deliveries. The balance had been crossed through in red. Paid E. Arthur adjusted his glasses. That was my grandmother. Do you know what E means? Mara asked. Arthur stared at the page for several seconds. Ellison, maybe? Mara's pulse lifted. Elias Ellison. That sounds right. He leaned back slowly. My grandmother used to talk about a Mr. Ellison at number 6. Haven't thought about that in 50 years. Evelyn leaned forward. What did she say Arthur gave? A short laugh. Mostly that he was too stubborn for his own good. Then his expression softened. He remembered hearing that his grandfather had been injured one winter and could not work for several months. The family fell behind on nearly everything, according to Arthur. A man at the warehouse kept allowing Margaret Mercer to collect basic goods through merchant accounts even when she could not pay on time. My grandmother said he told her to feed the children first and worry about the ledger later. Mara looked down at the journal. Did she say he paid the debt himself? No, just that one day it was gone. On the drive back, Lucy was unusually quiet. Finally, she asked, So Elias helped them? Mara kept her eyes on the road. Maybe. That sounds like helping. One story isn't proof. She heard the defensiveness in her own voice. Lucy did too. You don't want it to be true. I want to know what's true before we decide what it means. Back at warehouse number 6, Daniel had moved several buckets under fresh leaks. Rain had begun earlier than expected. Mara immediately returned to practical problems: wet boards, damaged inventory boxes, money she did not have. Gordon Pike arrived before sunset. He stood just inside the doorway, avoiding a puddle spreading across the floor. "Still thinking about my offer?" Mara folded her arms. I can make it 1,500. The new number hit harder than she expected. Pike glanced around. "This place is going to keep costing you, you know that?" He was right, which made Mara resent him more. Why raise the offer? "Because I'd rather settle now than spend months negotiating later." Nothing about his answer sounded sinister, just business. Mara looked toward Lucy, who was helping Evelyn place the journals farther from the damp wall. $1,500 could cover overdue bills. It could buy time. "I'll think about it," Mara said. Pike nodded and left his card again before walking out. That evening, Evelyn called Mara over to one of the journals. "Look at this." The entry was dated January 1954. A widow named Clara Bennett owed $14.70 for coal deliveries. The amount had been marked unpaid for 3 weeks. Then, in red ink, paid E.E. $14.70. Mara said, "That doesn't sound like much." "Not now," Evelyn replied, "but it mattered then." They found another canceled debt, then another, food, repairs, freight charges, small sums, mostly, different names, different circumstances. Always the same initials. Mara felt something shift inside her. These did not look like grand gestures. They looked like quiet interventions nobody had expected anyone to remember. "Maybe Elias had family money," Lucy said. Evelyn shook her head. "Not according to his employment records." Mara turned another page. "Then maybe these weren't really payments. Maybe the company absorbed them." Evelyn pointed to the notation. "If that were standard policy, why identify EE?" Mara had no answer. Over the next hour, they counted more than 30 entries across the surviving sections. Evelyn began adding the amounts on a sheet of paper. Even without adjusting for inflation, the total rose steadily. Mara watched the number grow, then looked again at the old payroll record, showing what a warehouse manager earned. "That can't be right," she said. Evelyn stopped writing. "What?" Mara tapped the total. "He couldn't have paid all of this." Lucy looked between them. "But it says he did." Mara stared at the columns of red marks. Elias Ellison had not been a wealthy owner. He had been a clerk, then a manager. Yet the journals credited him with clearing debts worth far more than his wages should have allowed. Evelyn slowly closed the ledger. "Then we've answered one question," she said. "He was helping people." Mara looked at the growing total beside her hand. "And created another." Evelyn nodded. "Where did the money come from?" For most of the night, Mara could not stop thinking about the total Evelyn had written beside the merchant journals. Elias Ellison's recorded wages were ordinary. The debts marked paid E were not. By morning, one possibility had begun to bother her more than the others. "What if he stole it?" she asked Evelyn when they met again at warehouse number 6. Evelyn looked up from the table. "That is one possibility." Mara hated how calmly she said it. "He had access to accounts. He was a clerk, then manager. If money was moving through here, maybe he redirected some of it." Lucy, sitting nearby with her homework, immediately looked up. "But he was helping people." "Helping people with stolen money is still stealing," Mara said. The words sounded harsher than she intended. Lucy lowered her eyes. Mara rubbed her forehead. She had spent several days allowing herself to imagine Elias as proof that the Ellison name had once meant something good in Bellwether. Now she wondered whether the journals were preserving something shameful instead. Outside, Daniel was on the roof replacing damaged flashing before the next storm. Mara joined him later to hand up materials. Though he repeatedly told her to stay on the ladder and not climb onto the weakened section, "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "Family history is apparently less relaxing than advertised." "Bad news, maybe?" She explained the missing money. "Daniel drove a screw into the metal flashing. Or maybe there's an explanation you haven't found." "That's what Lucy said." "Smart kid." Mara looked toward the warehouse doors. "Everyone keeps saying wait, investigate, understand. Meanwhile, the roof leaks. Today, Daniel stopped working. You want me to leave? I want to know what this is costing me. Materials so far, $86. And your time, nothing." Mara stared at him. "No, Mara, I can't keep taking free work." Daniel sat back on his heels. "You didn't ask me to rebuild the place. I'm keeping rain from destroying the papers and whatever inventory you move in. That's still work. Then pay me later." "With what?" Her voice rose. "The imaginary fortune in the walls." Daniel's expression tightened. "This isn't about the roof. It's absolutely about the roof, no. It's about you thinking accepting help means you failed twice." Mara said nothing. Daniel returned to the flashing. "Hand me the next piece." For several seconds, she considered climbing down and leaving him there. Instead, she passed it up. By afternoon, rain began lightly against the new patch. The worst leak held. Mara stood beneath it and felt both grateful and irritated by the relief. Her phone rang. The caller was from the company handling the last outstanding commercial account from Ellison Home and Mercantile. The balance had not changed. The deadline had not changed. The polite voice on the phone only made the situation feel more final. When the call ended, Mara sat on an overturned crate. Lucy came over without asking what had happened and leaned against her shoulder. "We're okay," Mara said automatically. Lucy sighed. "You always say that when we're not." Mara looked at her daughter. "For once?" She did not correct her. "Across the room." Daniel pretended not to hear. Lucy eventually returned to the hidden storage cavity, where several bundles of papers had not yet been sorted. 10 minutes later, she carried a thin stack to Evelyn. "These have the same name." Evelyn adjusted her glasses. The papers were property records and sale notices. The first documented a small residential parcel owned by Elias Ellison. Another showed its sale several years later. A third listed a narrow piece of land outside Bellwether, sold. Then came a certificate showing a modest share in a Canal merchant company, transferred for cash. Mara moved closer. "He owned all that?" "At different times." Evelyn said, "Not a fortune, but yes." They arranged the dates beside the journals. The first property sale occurred only weeks before a cluster of debts marked Paid E. Another sale came before a second group of canceled balances. The company shares were sold shortly before several of the largest payments. Evelyn did the arithmetic twice. "It fits," she said quietly. Mara stared at the page. "So he wasn't stealing. It doesn't look that way. He was selling his own things." Lucy spoke softly. "To pay for theirs." Mara picked up the record of the house sale. It listed an address, a value, a buyer. Nothing emotional. A house reduced to a few typed lines. She imagined Elias signing it away, then returning to the warehouse and quietly crossing red lines through other people's debts. "Why would anyone do that?" she asked. Evelyn looked at the journals. "Maybe because he thought they needed it more?" Mara thought of the store she had just lost. For weeks, she had measured herself by what remained. Fewer shelves, fewer customers, less money, no business. Elias had apparently chosen to own less. The difference unsettled her. Losing something and giving it up were not the same. But the records made her wonder whether ownership alone had ever proved what a life was worth. Lucy touched her sleeve. "Maybe being broke doesn't mean he failed." Mara looked down at her. The sentence landed too close to home. She swallowed. Maybe not. Daniel came inside carrying the last of his tools. Roof should hold for now. Mara hesitated, then said, "Thank you." He nodded as if that were enough. For the first time, she let it be. Evelyn returned to the remaining papers. Near the bottom of the bundle was a folded document with a faded merchant stamp. "Mara," she said, "you should see this." The heading was partially obscured, but one line remained clear. Transfer of Number 6 Family Trust. Mara read it twice. A trust. Evelyn carefully flattened the page. Apparently, Mara looked around at the warehouse, suddenly aware that Elias had not only sold property at some point, he had made a deliberate decision about this building, and whatever that decision had been, Warehouse Number 6 had not simply been abandoned. It had been transferred into his family's hands. The words family trust changed the way Mara looked at Warehouse Number 6. Until that moment, the building had been a bad purchase with a strange family connection. Now it felt deliberate. Someone had wanted it preserved, and that someone appeared to be Elias Ellison. The next morning, Mara met Evelyn at the county records office while Lucy was at school. They carried photocopies of the merchant journal pages, the faded transfer document, and the property records they had already found. The clerk brought out several deed indexes from the 1950s and 1960s, but the trail broke almost immediately. Warehouse Number 6 appeared under a trust designation, then vanished into a reference number connected to archived probate files. "Can we see those?" Mara asked. The clerk typed the number into a computer and frowned. "Possibly, but some of the older county records were moved twice. Once during renovation in the 70s, then again when the archive building closed." "So they're lost?" "Not necessarily. More like scattered." Mara almost laughed. Scattered seemed to describe everything she had inherited lately. Evelyn copied every reference number they could find. By lunchtime, they had established only one fact with confidence. The trust had existed. What it required remained unclear. Back at the warehouse, Daniel was checking the western wall where moisture had darkened several bricks near the foundation. Mara told him what they had found. "A family trust," he said. "That sounds promising." "It sounds expensive." "Everything sounds expensive to you, because everything is expensive." Daniel smiled faintly, but did not argue. Mara knelt beside a bucket, catching a slow drip. She had spent the morning chasing old paperwork while current bills continued accumulating. Her store debt had not disappeared because Elias Ellison once signed a trust. Gordon Pike arrived shortly after 2. He stood outside until Mara noticed him, then entered carrying a folder. "I heard you've been asking about old title records," he said. Mara stiffened. "Bellwether is a small town. Apparently too small." Pike ignored the irritation. "My offer still stands. 1,500. I can handle the title issues myself." Mara looked at the folder. "You really want this place?" "I want the parcel." "There's a difference." His answer was practical, almost dismissive. "And if the trust says I can't sell, then you don't sell. But until you know that, you're spending money on a building you can barely use." The remark struck because it was true. Pike placed the folder on a crate. Inside was a simple purchase offer with an expiration date. "I'm not trying to cheat you, Mara. I'm trying to buy property before it becomes complicated." "It already is." "Then maybe take the easy answer while you still have one." After he left, Mara stared at the paper for several minutes. Lucy arrived from school later and immediately noticed it. "Is that the warehouse offer?" "Yes." "Are we selling?" Mara folded the document. "I don't know." Lucy sat on the edge of a workbench. If Elias wanted the building kept, why did everyone forget Mara looked at her? Families forget things. But if he helped all those people, why did everyone forget him too? The question was innocent, but it stayed with Mara. She thought of Elias selling a house, land, company shares, quietly clearing debts, keeping families supplied. None of it had made him famous. His name was absent from town histories. There was no plaque, no photograph in the municipal hall, no street named after him. A man could apparently spend years helping people and still fade almost completely from memory. Mara felt an uncomfortable connection to that idea. Her store had consumed 7 years of her life, and within a few weeks its sign was down, its shelves empty, its name disappearing. Maybe being remembered wasn't the point, she said. Lucy considered that. Then what was? Mara had no answer. That evening Evelyn called with partial progress. She had found a copied index entry from the trust. Mara drove to the Historical Society with Lucy, where Evelyn had spread documents across the same table they had used before. "This is not the full instrument," Evelyn warned, "but it references the original conditions." She pointed to a typed line. "Property to remain within the Ellison family where practicable." Mara read it slowly. So Elias wanted us to keep it. Possibly, where practicable leaves room for circumstances, meaning if the family couldn't keep it, they could sell. Maybe. We need the full language. Mara felt disappointment she had not expected. Part of her had wanted a clean instruction, something that would make the decision for her. Instead, the document gave her another uncertainty. Anything about why he put it in trust? Evelyn turned the page. That's the problem. A note referenced a secondary clause describing intended use of the property after commercial canal operations ceased. The clause itself was missing. So the most important part is gone, Mara said. For now, Evelyn explained that a duplicate might have been filed with an attorney, a church, a merchant association, or copied into private records. None of that guaranteed it still existed. Mara pressed her fingers against her temples. We know Elias paid debts. We know he sold his own property. We know he put number 6 into a family trust, and we still don't know what he wanted anyone to do with it. Lucy looked at the copied index. Maybe he left instructions somewhere else. Mara gave her a tired smile. You make everything sound simple. Sometimes it is. The next afternoon, Mara returned to the warehouse, determined to focus on something practical. She and Lucy sorted the remaining papers from the hidden wall cavity, while Daniel repaired a damaged door brace. Most documents were invoices and freight slips. Dust covered everything. Several envelopes had rotted open. Lucy worked patiently, making separate piles by size because the dates were often unreadable. You missed one, she said. She reached behind the back panel of the old crate and pulled out a narrow envelope flattened against the wood. Unlike the others, it had been wrapped in waxed paper. The outer covering cracked when Mara touched it, but the envelope beneath remained intact. There was no stamp, no address, only a handwritten sentence across the front. Evelyn, who had arrived to collect another set of ledger photographs, came closer. Mara read the words once, then again. For whoever keeps number 6, Lucy whispered. That sounds like us. Mara slid a finger under the edge but stopped before breaking the seal. The handwriting had survived for decades, waiting for someone who still possessed the building. Mara looked around the warehouse, at the patched roof, the damp bricks, the old iron E, then back at the envelope in her hands. Whatever Elias had failed to explain in the trust might be sitting inside it. Mara held the sealed envelope for nearly a full minute before opening it. Lucy stood beside her, unusually still, while Evelyn watched from across the table. Even Daniel had stopped working on the damaged door brace. The waxed paper had protected the envelope well, but the flap resisted at first. Mara slid a thin letter opener beneath it and carefully lifted the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet, yellowed at the edges but dry. The handwriting matched several notes they had seen in the merchant journals. Mara unfolded it and began to read silently. Then Lucy whispered, "Read it out loud." Mara looked at her daughter and started again. Elias wrote that warehouse number 6 had given him a living, but the warehouse itself had never been the thing worth preserving. The people who came through its doors were boatmen, clerks, widows, shopkeepers, laborers, families behind on payments, merchants trying to survive a bad season. He wrote that a building was useful only when it served someone. He warned whoever inherited number 6 not to turn it into a monument to him or to the Ellison name. Near the bottom of the page was a line Mara read twice before continuing. "If this place remains in our family, let it remain useful." Lucy smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." Mara lowered the letter. "It sounds like what we already guessed." Evelyn leaned closer. "Not exactly. It tells us what mattered to him, but not what the trust requires." "No." Mara hated how quickly hope turned into another incomplete answer. She had wanted the letter to solve something practical. Instead, Elias had left a principle. Principles did not fix roofs. They did not pay creditors. They did not tell her whether she should accept Gordon Pike's offer. Daniel returned to his work, giving Mara space. Evelyn photographed the letter and compared the handwriting with the journal entries. Lucy kept rereading the sentence about remaining useful. Mara folded the page carefully and put it back into the envelope. "Useful how?" she asked. Evelyn shook her head. "He doesn't say." That evening, Mara took the letter home. Lucy sat at the kitchen table doing math homework while Mara opened bills. The contrast felt almost cruel. Elias had written about service and responsibility from another century, while Mara had $43 due for electricity and a commercial debt she still had no plan to settle. Her phone buzzed. A message from Gordon Pike reminded her that his purchase offer would expire the following afternoon. $1,500. Enough to ease several immediate problems. Not enough to rebuild her life, but enough to breathe. Mara looked toward Lucy. "What would you think if I sold number 6? Lucy kept her pencil on the page. "Do you want to? That's not what I asked." "I know." Mara waited. Lucy finally looked up. "I like the warehouse, but I don't care if we keep it." Mara was surprised. "You don't?" "Not if keeping it makes you scared all the time." Mara looked down at the bills. "I'm trying not to make you worry." Lucy gave her the tired expression of a child who had heard that before. "I worry more when you pretend." Mara looked away. "I just don't want you thinking I failed you." Lucy's face changed. "I never said that." "I know. I never thought it." Mara swallowed. Lucy continued, quieter now. "The store closed. That's not the same thing as you failing me," Mara wanted to answer, but nothing came quickly enough. Lucy returned to her homework, leaving the sentence in the room between them. The next morning, Mara went to warehouse number 6 before sunrise. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later and found her sitting on an overturned crate with Pike's offer beside her. "Decision day?" he asked. Apparently, he did not tell her what to do. That irritated her almost as much as advice would have. "You have an opinion," Mara said. "Of course." And Daniel set down his tool bag. "It's your building." "That's not an opinion." "Fine. If you sell because you need the money, that's reasonable. If you keep it because you think Elias is giving you orders from 70 years ago, that's less reasonable." Mara stared at him. "Helpful. You asked." Daniel crouched beside the western wall and examined the damp line. "The better question is what you want." Mara looked around the warehouse. "I don't know." Then don't pretend the journals can decide for you. After he walked away, Mara unfolded Elias's letter again. Remain useful. She thought about Arthur Mercer's grandmother receiving coal when she could not pay, about families whose debts disappeared in red ink, about Elias selling pieces of his own life to keep other people from losing theirs. Mara had spent weeks thinking of herself as someone who needed rescuing. She hated that feeling. Yet the people in those journals had probably hated it too. They had been shopkeepers, workers, parents, people who had fallen behind temporarily, people who might have needed only a little room to stand again. By noon, Gordon Pike arrived. He placed the purchase agreement on the table. Last chance at $1,500. Mara read the first page. The number looked enormous compared with the $180 she had paid, and painfully small compared with what she owed. If I sign, how fast? A few days, assuming title clears. Mara pictured the relief. Then she pictured the red entries in the journals. Not because Elias would judge her for selling. His own letter said nothing about sacrifice for sacrifice's sake. What troubled her was that she still did not understand what he had tried to preserve. I need until the end of the day, she said. Pike sighed. End of the day. He left. Mara returned to sorting the letter with Evelyn, searching for anything they had overlooked. Near the lower margin, beneath Elias's signature, Evelyn noticed a faint sentence written in smaller script. Wait. She angled the page toward the light. Mara read over her shoulder. Reference agreement beneath the merchant seal. What merchant seal? Mara asked. Evelyn's expression sharpened. I don't know. They checked the journals, the crate, and the loose documents again. Nothing clearly matched. Mara felt the deadline pressing closer. At 5:30, Pike called. Mara stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. She still had no answer for him. That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, Mara sat at the kitchen table with the merchant seal phrase written on a scrap of paper. At 9:42, her phone rang. Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. Mara answered immediately. Evelyn did not say hello. I found it. Mara straightened. Found what? Storage inventory from the old church archive. Years ago, the Merchants Association deposited records there after their office closed. One box is listed separately. Papers rustled on Evelyn's end. It says Merchant Agreements, Harrow Canal. Sealed copies. Mara's heart began to beat faster. Where is it? Still in the church archive, according to the inventory. Evelyn paused. And Mara? The box is marked with the same merchant seal Elias referenced. The old church archive occupied 2 rooms behind a fellowship hall that had not been renovated in decades. Mara arrived just after 8 the next morning with Evelyn and Lucy, while Daniel stayed at warehouse number 6 to finish securing the damaged door. Evelyn had already called ahead, and a volunteer unlocked a narrow storage room lined with metal shelves. Dust covered nearly everything. Inventory says the box should be on the 3rd shelf. Evelyn said. They searched for 15 minutes before Lucy spotted a faded label behind 2 cartons of hymnals. Merchant Agreements, Harrow Canal. The cardboard had softened with age, but the contents were protected inside a wooden document case stamped with a circular seal. Mara recognized the design immediately from the notation in Elias's letter. That's it. Evelyn lifted the case carefully onto a table. Inside were copies of agreements between merchants, warehouse operators, transport companies, and canal businesses dating back several decades. Most were ordinary contracts. Rates, storage rules, freight responsibilities, payment terms. Mara tried not to feel disappointed. Then Evelyn found a separate packet tied with cotton tape. The heading read, Mutual Assistance Agreement, Harrow Canal Merchants. Mara leaned closer. The agreement described a voluntary arrangement among participating merchants to prevent temporary hardship from destroying small businesses and families that depended on the canal trade. It was not charity in the formal sense. The language was practical. Merchants could extend payment deadlines, provide limited goods on account, offer temporary work, cover essential repairs, or absorb small debts when a family or business faced short-term crisis. This is what he was doing. Lucy said. Evelyn nodded slowly. Not by himself. Mara read the names beneath the agreement. Several companies had signed. Elias Ellison's name appeared later in the amendments as a local administrator for warehouse number 6. The discovery changed the shape of everything. Elias had not secretly acted outside the merchant system. He had helped organize a system inside it. The red markings in the journals were not random acts of generosity. They were records of people being given time. So the money didn't all come from him. Mara said, some did. Evelyn replied, pointing toward the sale records they had already found, but this suggests he also used merchant participation. Another document listed the forms assistants could take. Coal for a household until winter work resumed. Freight credit for a boatman whose vessel needed repair. Food accounts extended for families of injured workers. Temporary storage without charge for a shopkeeper after a fire. Mara stared at the examples. None promised to make anyone rich. They only kept one bad month from becoming the end of everything. She thought of her own store, how quickly slow sales had turned into late payments, then fees, then choices between inventory and rent. The system Elias helped run had been designed for people exactly at that edge, people not incapable, just trapped by timing. Lucy touched one line with her finger without pressing the page. He gave people another chance. Mara nodded. Looks like it. Evelyn found an amendment dated several years later. Elias's signature appeared at the bottom beside the same ornate E used on the warehouse door and Mara's father's pocket watch. The amendment stated that private funds could be contributed to sustain the assistance pool during downturns. Mara understood then why Elias had sold property. He had not been paying every debt alone. He had been keeping the system alive when the merchants could no longer support it enough. The thought made his choices seem less mysterious and more difficult. He had known exactly what the money was for. Mara sat back. He wasn't trying to save the canal. Evelyn looked at her. What do you mean? He was trying to keep people from falling through it. They continued sorting. Near the bottom of the case, Evelyn found a certified copy of the trust instrument. The missing clause was there. Mara felt her pulse quicken as Evelyn read aloud. Upon permanent cessation of commercial canal operations, warehouse number 6 was to remain, where practicable, in Ellison family stewardship and be used for purposes consistent with the original Mutual Assistance Agreement, trade support, temporary commercial relief, shared work, storage, or other community benefit. Lucy smiled. That's why he kept it. Mara read the clause again. There was no command to preserve the building as a museum, no requirement to honor Elias. The warehouse itself was meant to remain useful, exactly as the letter had said. Evelyn looked at Mara. This answers the trust question. It also gives me a bigger problem. How Mara folded her arms. Because now I know what the building was for, and I still can't afford it. By afternoon, they were back at number 6. Daniel listened while Mara explained the agreement. He glanced around the vast floor. Shared work, storage, trade support. In other words, everything this place used to do. Pretty much. Mara walked toward the center of the warehouse. For the first time, she imagined the space not filled with her unsold inventory, but divided into smaller areas. Tables, workbenches, storage cages, cheap stalls, people who could not afford full storefronts. The idea arrived so naturally that it frightened her. "When my store started failing," she said, "the rent didn't care whether I had a bad month. Neither did the utility company. Neither did the suppliers." Daniel nodded. "That's business." "Maybe that's the problem." Lucy was listening from the old workbench. Mara continued, more to herself than anyone else. "What if someone only needed 6 months somewhere cheap? Or a place to sell on weekends? Or storage until they got back on their feet?" Daniel looked at her. "Sounds useful." Mara almost laughed at the word, useful. She could see Elias's handwriting in her mind. Evelyn placed a list of the first assistance recipients on the table. 7 names appeared together in one early record. Each person had lost a business, work contract, or stable income before receiving support through the merchant agreement. Mara read the list twice. They were not failures. They were people between one version of their lives and the next. The realization made something inside her loosen. She had been telling herself that bankruptcy had placed her outside the world of capable people. Elias's records suggested something else. Capable people sometimes needed room to begin again. Her phone rang. Gordon Pike. Mara stepped away from the others and answered. "I need your decision," he said. "The offer expired yesterday." "I know. I can still honor it if we finish this now." Mara looked around warehouse number 6. The roof still needed work. The drainage problem had not disappeared. She still had debt. Keeping the building made no financial sense yet, but selling it now would end the question before she had even tried to answer what number 6 could become. Pike waited. Mara took one breath. "I'm not selling." Silence. Then Pike said, "You're sure?" Mara looked at Lucy, at Daniel, at Evelyn, at the old wall where the journals had been hidden. "Yes." Pike did not argue. "All right." The call ended. Mara lowered the phone. Relief came first, then fear. Daniel read her face. "You told him no." "I did." Lucy smiled. Evelyn closed the agreement case. Mara looked up at the patched roof and the damp western bricks, suddenly aware of every dollar the building would demand. She knew now why warehouse number 6 had been kept. She knew what Elias had tried to preserve. She even knew what she wanted the building to become. What she did not know was how a bankrupt single mother with almost no money was supposed to keep it standing. Mara did not know how to save warehouse number 6, so she started by telling the truth about it. Evelyn suggested the Historical Society host a small public viewing of the merchant journals before any restoration began. Mara resisted at first. The idea of standing in front of strangers and explaining that she had bought a crumbling warehouse for $180 while bankrupt sounded less like history and more like public humiliation. But Evelyn reminded her that the journals did not belong only to the Ellison family story. The names inside them belonged to Bellwether. 2 evenings later, they arranged copies of selected pages on folding tables inside the Historical Society. Mara expected a dozen curious people. More than 40 arrived. Arthur Mercer came first, carrying a framed black and white photograph of his grandmother Margaret standing outside a small grocery shop. He placed it beside the journal page where her coal and food debts had been crossed out in red. "That's her," he told Lucy. "She kept that shop another 31 years. Another woman recognized the name Bennett and returned 20 minutes later with a letter her mother had saved. A retired mechanic brought a photograph of a delivery truck belonging to the Hale family. Someone else remembered hearing that a grandfather had been allowed to store damaged furniture at number 6 after a fire destroyed his shop. None of the stories were dramatic alone. Together, they formed the history the official records had missed. Mara stood near the wall listening as strangers filled gaps in Elias Ellison's journals with voices, faces, and family memories. A man in his 60s approached her with tears in his eyes and pointed to one of the names. "My father was 12 when that happened," he said. "He always said somebody at the Canal gave his family time when nobody else would." Mara looked at the red notation beside the debt. "Paid EE. We thought Elias paid everything himself at first," she explained. "He did use some of his own money, but there was also a merchant agreement. They gave people credit. Work, storage, repairs, whatever kept one bad season from becoming permanent." The man nodded slowly. "Sounds like something worth remembering by the end of the evening." Evelyn had collected copies of 6 photographs, 3 letters, and written accounts from 9 families. The journals were no longer only evidence that Elias had existed. They were evidence that the system around warehouse number 6 had worked. That mattered to Mara more than she expected. The next morning, she spread photographs and copies of the merchant agreement across the warehouse table while Daniel measured the western drainage channel. "People keep asking what happens to this place now," she said. "What do you tell them? That I don't know." Daniel looked at her. "You do know." Mara glanced across the open floor. "I know what I want. That's different." She described the idea more clearly than she had before. Small market stalls instead of full storefronts. Shared storage, work tables, weekend selling space. Short-term agreements for people starting over who could not afford commercial rent. Not charity, not free forever, just enough room to get moving. Daniel listened without interrupting. "That sounds like a plan. It sounds like a plan that costs money." "Most plans do." Mara gave him a look. "Thank you for that financial wisdom." He smiled. "You're welcome." Evelyn arrived carrying another envelope from the county archive. Inside was the final title confirmation linked to the trust records recovered from the church. The county had located a duplicate filing that matched the certified trust copy. There was no hidden ownership dispute, no unknown claimant. The family trust language was valid in the historical chain, and Mara's auction purchase had returned the property to Ellison ownership under the surviving conditions. "So that part is settled?" Mara asked. Evelyn nodded. "As settled as old property records get." Mara exhaled. One question that had followed them since the hidden journals were found finally closed. Elias had preserved Warehouse No. 6 because he wanted it used to support people who needed another chance. The building had not survived by accident. The practical problem remained. Mara needed lumber, drainage work, safer wiring, basic fixtures, insurance, and more money than she possessed. Instead of asking the town to rescue her, she posted a notice through the Historical Society and local business board. She described what the journals had revealed and invited anyone interested in helping create a low-cost shared market to meet at number 6 on Saturday. She expected curiosity. What arrived was labor. Arthur Mercer brought 2 nephews and a pickup full of usable shelving from a closed storeroom. A woman whose grandmother appeared in the journals offered tables from a former church sale. A retired electrician volunteered to inspect the wiring and list what could safely be reused. 2 local shop owners donated leftover paint. People brought photographs, coffee, tools, and stories. No one pretended the repairs were finished. No one promised miracles. But for the first time, Mara could imagine progress measured in more than money. Daniel coordinated the repair work without taking over. Evelyn began planning a small archive display, using copies of the journals so the originals could remain protected. Lucy spent most of the afternoon drawing possible signs for the future market. At one point, Mara found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by pencils. "You already named it?" Mara asked. Lucy turned the page around. "The Harrow Market," Mara read the words twice. "That's actually good." "I know," Mara laughed. By sunset, the western wall was cleared, damaged shelving removed, and a temporary drainage trench marked for work the next morning. The warehouse still looked rough, but it no longer looked abandoned. Mara stood in the doorway watching people load tools into vehicles. She realized she had spent years believing independence meant never owing anyone anything. Elias's journals had shown something different. People could help each other without making one person smaller. After everyone left, Mara stayed behind to organize the merchant journals before locking up. She opened the final volume to check a loose binding. 2 pages near the back were still stuck together from old moisture damage. Evelyn had warned her not to force them, but the edge had dried enough to separate slightly. Mara worked carefully with a thin sheet of paper until the pages released. A line of handwriting appeared near the bottom of the newly exposed page. It was not an account entry. It was a sentence in Elias's hand. Mara leaned closer and read the first words. "If you are reading this because you have lost your way," Mara read the sentence again, then carefully separated the rest of the page. The handwriting was faded but clear enough. "If you are reading this because you have lost your way, begin again here." She sat down on the edge of the old workbench. For weeks, Elias Ellison had existed to her as initials, signatures, property records, and red marks beside other people's debts. Now the sentence felt less like history and more like a hand reaching across time. Not because Elias could have known who would eventually read it. He could not have known Mara or Lucy, or that the store called Ellison Home and Mercantile would ever exist. He had simply understood that families repeated certain struggles. Businesses failed, work disappeared, people lost confidence. Someone, someday, might return to number 6 carrying the same shame as the people who had once walked through its doors. Mara pressed her fingers against her mouth. Tears came before she could stop them. Lucy, who had been drawing at the far table, noticed immediately. Mara tried to wipe her face. "I'm fine." Lucy gave her the familiar look that meant she no longer believed that phrase. Mara laughed weakly through the tears. "Okay, I'm not fine." Lucy came beside her. Mara turned the journal so she could read the line. Lucy read it slowly, then looked at her mother. "That's you." Mara nodded. "I think it is." For the first time since the store closed, she told Lucy the part she had kept buried. She admitted that losing Ellison Home and Mercantile had made her feel as if 7 years of work had meant nothing. She admitted that every unpaid bill felt like evidence that she had made bad decisions. Most of all, she admitted that she had been afraid Lucy would remember the bankruptcy as the moment her mother failed her. Lucy listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, the warehouse was quiet, except for the faint drip of water somewhere near the repaired wall. "I never thought you failed me." Lucy said, "I know you said that before." "Because you keep not believing me." Mara looked at her. Lucy continued, "The store was a store. You're my mom." The simplicity of it broke something open in Mara. She pulled Lucy close and held her longer than she usually did. There was no solution in the hug. The debts still existed. The warehouse still needed repairs. But for once, Mara did not measure the moment by what remained unpaid. Over the following months, warehouse number 6 changed slowly. Nothing happened overnight. The western drainage channel was repaired first because the building could not become anything useful while water continued entering it. Daniel supervised structural repairs and turned one side room into a shared workshop. The retired electrician who had volunteered after the Historical Society event helped make the basic wiring safe. Donated shelving was cleaned, sanded, and installed. The old tables from the church became display counters. Mara used almost none of the building as private storage. Instead, she divided the main floor into small spaces that could be rented cheaply by the week or month. Evelyn established a modest archive corner near the front entrance with copies of selected merchant journal pages, family photographs, and a short explanation of the Canal Mutual Assistance Agreement. The original journals remained protected. Lucy insisted that the display include more names of the people Elias had helped than information about Elias himself. "He said not to make it a monument," she reminded Mara. "You're right." Mara chose a journal page containing several red debt cancellations, but no special praise for Elias. She wanted visitors to see the names first. The Harrow Market opened on a cool Saturday morning. Lucy's hand-painted sign hung above the entrance. The first vendors were exactly the kind of people Mara had imagined when she read the merchant agreement, a woman who baked bread from her home kitchen and needed somewhere legal to sell on weekends. A carpenter testing whether custom furniture could become full-time work. Two sisters selling repaired vintage clothing. A man who fixed lamps and small appliances. A mother making soap after losing her previous job. None needed saving. They needed affordable space. Mara took the smallest stall near the back. She unpacked the remaining merchandise from Ellison Home and Mercantile kitchen towels, bowls, lamps, small household goods that had once seemed like proof of failure on opening day. The first item she sold was one of the ceramic bowls that had survived the final clearance sale. The customer paid $8. Mara stared at the bill for a second before placing it in the cash box. Lucy grinned. "First sale, again." Mara said, "First sale, again." Daniel spent most of the morning in the workshop helping one vendor stabilize a display table. Evelyn guided visitors through the archive corner and corrected anyone who described Elias as a secret millionaire. He wasn't. Mara heard her say more than once that distinction mattered. There had been no hidden fortune in warehouse number 6, no gold behind the wall, no bank account waiting for Mara. The merchant journals were valuable because they revealed something harder to price. Elias had used what he had, then persuaded others to do the same. So ordinary families could survive ordinary disasters. Near midday, Gordon Pike appeared at the entrance. Mara saw him pause beneath Lucy's sign before walking inside. She expected awkwardness. Instead, Pike looked around at the occupied stalls, the restored brick, the customers moving through the building. "You did more with it than I would have," he said. Mara smiled. "You wanted the parcel." "I did." He glanced toward the archive display. "I didn't see much value in the building." "Neither did I at first." Pike nodded. "Looks like you found some." There was no apology and no defeat in his voice. Mara did not need either. "Different kind," she said. Pike bought a loaf of bread from the first stall before leaving late that afternoon, when the crowd thinned. Mara stood near the front wall with Lucy. The iron E remained on the old door exactly where they had found it. Mara had considered restoring it, polishing it, making it brighter. In the end, she left the metal worn and dark beneath it. Lucy had mounted a smaller wooden plaque she had painted herself. Number 6, Second Beginnings. Mara traced the edge of the sign. Months earlier, she had arrived at the warehouse believing $180 might have purchased the worst mistake she had made since losing her store. Instead, it had brought her into a story she had never known belonged to her. More importantly, it had changed what she thought inheritance meant. Elias had not left wealth. He had left a pattern. Someone struggled. Someone else made room. The person who recovered eventually became capable of making room for another. That evening, vendors counted their first day's earnings and packed away merchandise. A few had made very little. One had sold almost everything. Nobody knew which businesses would last. Mara understood that better than anyone. Success was not guaranteed simply because a door had opened. But the door had opened. Lucy stood beside her as they watched the final vendor leave. "Do you think Great-Great-Grandpa would like it?" she asked. Mara looked across the warehouse, at the shared work tables, at the shelves, at the archive filled with names that had nearly disappeared, at her own small stall in the corner, no longer a reminder of the business she had lost, but a place from which she could begin again. She remembered Elias's letter. "Not a monument. Remain useful. I think he'd be glad it's useful," Mara said. Lucy smiled. Mara switched off the main lights. Together, they stepped outside and pulled the heavy warehouse doors shut before locking it. Mara looked once more at the old iron E and the small sign beneath it. Then she turned the key, for the first time since her store went bankrupt. The sound of a door closing did not feel like an ending,